There was a time when KTM felt like the coolest motorcycle company on earth. I remember those days, back when their bikes were for hardcore dirt boys or serious supermoto squids. Back in 2005, the OG Super Duke was an analog hypernaked beast. Their bikes, designed by Kiska, were stylistically extreme and mechanically peculiar, totally unlike anything made by the Japanese or even other Euro brands. But somewhere between then and now, well, KTM started sucking, and all you orange bleeders can just chill out. No matter how long your Reddit post is, I'm not going to agree with you that the camshaft replacement is just simply a regular maintenance item. And frankly, all the reliability issues don't even tell the whole story. In the mid-2010s, KTM started to diversify. What started with beginner bikes led to global partnerships, rapid overhauls, and brand acquisitions, and honestly, a whole lot of financial mismanagement. KTM stopped being this niche Austrian performance company and tried to become a huge global brand that, in my opinion, they were never really meant to be. So to figure out when and why KTM started sucking, we have to dig a little deeper. Let's dive in. Back in the 90s and early 2000s, the big four were pushing performance boundaries with bikes like the Gixxer Thau, R1, or the Fireblade. And despite being more powerful and advanced every year, they were relatively predictable, refined, and reliable. For the financially endowed, Ducati represented the exotic emotional option. Bikes like the 916 era Superbike or the original Monster felt dramatic and temperamental in a way that was romantic. In the wake of the long way round, BMW was rising to power as the default manufacturer of mile-eating adventure bikes for dentists and accountants. For those of you who haven't seen the series or may not remember, there's actually a key moment that the KTM execs have kicked themselves over the last 20 years. Ewan and Charlie actually first approached KTM to supply the bikes for their round-the-world trip. However, believing they would be unsuccessful, KTM refused, thinking it would be bad PR for the brand. I know. They ended up on BMW GSs instead, and since that moment, the BMW GS has been the most ubiquitous adventure bike ever made. There is some alternate timeline where KTM's story arc looks completely different. Now, this isn't the moment when KTM started sucking, but it definitely played a part in one way or another. And I do often wonder, what would have happened if they did use KTMs? Maybe their camshafts wouldn't have made it long way around. I don't know. Either way, I digress. At this time, KTM felt completely different from Hondas, Ducatis, or even BMWs. Their bikes were loud, angular, aggressive, and light in a way that others just weren't. I mean, they didn't even build a street-legal motorcycle until 1994, many decades after other global brands already were doing that. They were born from off-road competition, enduro, motocross, the Dakar Rally, and even supermoto racing. They weren't trying to build approachable or accessible motorcycles for commuters, suburbanites, or bike night NPCs. They built motorcycles for people that wanted the pinnacle of performance at the expense of ease of ownership. Even today, dirt boys will go to the ends of the earth to defend KTM because of what their bikes are capable of, and trumping the Japanese alternatives in nearly every regard. Well, at least when they're running right. KTM's early foray into street bikes still carried that extreme performance-oriented DNA, but it was performance in a way that was totally different from your run-of-the-mill sport bikes of the time. Their street bikes were upright, torquey, and light in a way that was novel and genuine for road-going motorcycles. And sure, the Duke 620 was not going to beat out a Japanese 600 in a straight line, but it was fun in a way that a straight-laced supersport just simply couldn't dream of. The early 990 adventure bikes looked like futuristic military vehicles. The enduro and supermoto models turned public roads into skate parks. Early KTMs were not polished. They were analog, raw, and almost unfinished feeling, but they had personality and spirit. They felt like they were designed by riders for riders, and at the end of the early aughts, KTM was still about as niche as a production motorcycle company could be. And that's the problem being a niche Austrian company. They don't make a lot of money. It was decided that KTM needed to be more than just a former dirt bike company that sells motorcycles for hard-edged purists. They needed scale, and as they grew, things started to change. By the late 2000s, KTM was in a weird spot. They had built one of the strongest identities in modern motorcycling, but identity alone does not pay the bills, especially not when you're competing against Japanese manufacturers with seemingly infinite resources and global reach. KTM had passion, dirt racing pedigree, and a loyal cult following, but they didn't have massive sales volume. Being a niche brand with low volume is hard enough, but it is doubly hard in the midst of a once-in-a-lifetime financial crisis. At this point, the sport bike craze had fully cooled off. The easy credit and disposable income that made Y2K era boom times of motorcycling just come to an end. Younger riders were struggling to afford expensive motorcycles and pricey supersport insurance policies. Meanwhile, the small displacement bikes that were exploding in popularity in Asia and developing markets were starting to make sense in America. For the longest time, the Ninja 250 was the default small bike option, but the early to mid 2010s brought on a beginner bike renaissance. Honda had the CBR 300R, Suzuki had the GSX 250, and Yamaha, of course, had the R3, the motorcycle that I actually started my riding journey on many years ago. KTM realized that small bikes were the next big wave. That was how they would increase volume exponentially. They needed a small displacement bike that almost anybody could ride and most could afford, and their new partnership with Indian company Bajaj was the ticket to making that happen. KTM first partnered with Bajaj in 2007. Nowadays, Indian-made bikes are everywhere with Royal Enfield, Triumphs, and even Aprilias, but back then, that was kind of a bold move. But it made sense because Bajaj got access to KTM's engineering and performance image, while KTM gained affordable manufacturing and access to global markets. Sounds pretty smart to me, and honestly, they were way ahead of the curve on that one. Now KTM could build smaller bikes at scale without Austrian labor costs sending MSRPs into the stratosphere. This partnership gave way to bikes like the Duke 125, the 200, and most notably, the Duke 390. And this is where things really started to shift. Alright, I'm not gonna lie, I have a pretty sweet life here on YouTube being Yami noob, but my least favorite part about this whole thing is letting my giveaway bikes go. I have enjoyed this Aprilia 210 V4 factory so much. I have really loved riding this bike, but it's time for me to say goodbye because this Friday is the last chance you have to get entered to win. That means you gotta head over to yaminoob.co, link down below, pick up a hat, a t-shirt, hoodie, anything you need. Every dollar you spend will be an entry to win, subject to our multiplier, and you'll get entered to win this motorcycle. But if you become a member, you'll get your entries locked in for this bike and all of our future giveaway bikes as well. The next one we're doing after this bike is a Panigale V4, so you're not gonna wanna miss that one. Head to the website, get entered to win, don't miss it. The Duke 390 is not a bad bike by any means. Sure, there were lots of teething pains in early models. Head gasket issues, leaks, electrical gremlins, a lot of things. But once those got sorted, the Duke became a formidable force in the class. It brought way more people into KTM's world, and in certain markets, the 390 is the KTM. Not the Super Duke, not the RC8C, not the adventure bikes. In India, the 390 is the flagship. Even here in North America, the 390, with its excellent components and high-end features, set a new standard for what a beginner bike could be. Financially, the global partnership with Bajaj worked pretty well, because in 2009, KTM sold around 50,000 motorcycles, with only 15,000 being street bikes. By 2023, they had sold almost 300,000. But you know what they say, more money, more problems, and that's exactly what was in store for KTM. The Duke 390 changed KTM in ways that went far beyond just sales numbers, because once KTM realized they could compete in the entry-level market, they started expanding aggressively into basically every category. The Super Duke became one of the most respected hyper-naked motorcycles on the market. The Super Adventure gave the BMW GS a run for its money in the ADV segment, and their MotoGP effort showed they were to be taken seriously in road racing as well as motocross. To be honest, we could probably make a whole video about KTM's MotoGP involvement, and maybe we will. It's a crazy story, but it's too much for this video. In a decade, KTM went from being the transgressive dirt bike company to looking emblematic of the future of motorcycling. Global manufacturing, pivotal ownership shares, access to parts and technology that you'd never expect from a boutique brand. That's why even their cheapest bikes have adjustable WP suspension and massive TFTs. This is stuff that we think a lot about now with CF Motos, but KTM kinda did it first. They got those orange Cheeto-stained fingers in a lot of different pies. But this is where things start to get messy, because KTM started changing and growing and also expanding at an unprecedented rate. Their lineup started multiplying at an absurd pace. Duke, 125, 200, 250, 390, 690, 790, 890, 900, 1290, 1390, R models, Evo models, Adventure models, GT versions, Husqvarna versions that are basically the same motorcycle but wearing skinny jeans and weird glasses, then Gas, which is just KTM looking at their lineup and being like, but what if they were all painted red? And then they partnered with CF Moto in China. Is that a smart financial move? According to boardroom execs and profit projections, probably. I mean, this was insane. CF Moto gets KTM engine designs and then becomes responsible for all the manufacturing dirty work, while KTM just gets to sit back and spend their precious time on the flagship stuff. The Bajaj partnership worked out great. Why wouldn't doubling down be twice as good? Eventually, something had to give. You could already start to feel KTM's identity shifting during this period. The old bikes, which are still praised by KTM stands for being the pinnacle of the brand, were rough around the edges in an endearing way. They were raw, analog, and boutique. Of course, you had to make concessions to optimize performance when operating at a small scale, but their newer bikes started to feel rough around the edges in like half-baked kind of ways. Sort of like KTM was scaling faster than the company could manage, which are two very different things. And once KTM started positioning themselves as a global brand competing directly against BMW, Triumph, Yamaha, Honda, Ducati, people stopped tolerating the shortcomings. Reliability and quality control matters a whole lot more when you're selling 300,000 bikes a year to average Joes compared to selling 50,000 a year to die-hard loyal enthusiasts. It's a very different game. I think KTM got a little too used to selling bikes to people who understood that KTMs just have quirks and that they thought the general riding population would give them a pass too, which, given the state KTM currently sits in, does not seem to be the case. Now is when reliability concerns enter the chat. You've seen the memes, the arguments on our KTM, the flagrant comments anytime we discuss KTM on this channel. KTMs are one of the least reliable motorcycle companies. That is just a fact. But like I said, for years, the only people buying KTMs were diehard enthusiasts who were willing to contend with the brand's shortcomings for cutting-edge performance. Anything exotic is going to require more specialized care. Sure, we all know that. But when KTM started selling bikes to everyone under the sun, you can't really excuse the problems. As KTM grew, you started seeing more widespread issues across the entire lineup. Electrical gremlins were to be expected, sensors failing, oil leaks, cooling issues, TFT glitches, and then of course the infamous camshaft scandal, which sort of encapsulates the modern KTM experience. Owners of the 790 and 890 twins started discovering severe camshaft wear early into ownership. KTM initially denied this at length. Many owners had to pay out of pocket for replacements. KTM claimed the issue was related to poor lubrication and was fixed quietly on new models. New models then retained the issue. Then, after enough public outcry, KTM admitted fault, extended warranties, and backpedaled previous statements. Not a good look. Because while trust is built very slowly, it's taken away very quickly. Now, meanwhile, somehow independently of the camshaft issue, KTM's parent company, the Pierer Mobility Group, was going bankrupt. KTM's post-COVID sales boom gave the company a gigantic ego boost. I mean, do you remember those times? They were insane. In the early 2020s, motorcycle sales were sky high, and the Pierer Mobility Group foolishly thought that this growth would just last forever. They bought up companies, started making e-bikes, and scaling up production. And then sales slowly trickled down and dealers were drowning in inventory. It's a story as old as time. Business expands, sales go down, the overhead stays. Guess what? You're no longer in the black. Pierer was allegedly pushing massive amounts of motorcycles onto dealerships to inflate sales figures and maintain the illusion of endless growth. Production eventually had to slow down because there were simply too many unsold motorcycles just sitting around. Then came layoffs, cost-cutting, production pauses, financial restructuring, outsourcing, factory slowdowns, and suddenly, the company that spent years trying to position itself as the future of premium motorcycling started looking dangerously over-leveraged, which is honestly sort of poetic. KTM became the exact thing they spent decades rebelling against, a bloated corporate motorcycle empire obsessed with growth. And now, here we are. Bajaj came in as the brand's savior in exchange for increased ownership and control. CF Moto is becoming more and more powerful every year. KTM is restructuring after expanding way too aggressively, and their reputation for reliability currently sits somewhere between concerning and active class action lawsuit. But weirdly enough, I don't think this story ends with KTM disappearing. If anything, this might have just been the reset they really needed, because underneath all the financial chaos, outsourcing, platform sharing, and camshaft memes, KTM still knows how to build motorcycles with personality. The industry still needs companies willing to make wild, slightly irresponsible motorcycles for people with questionable taste and decent credit scores. The lesson here isn't that growth is bad. It's that somewhere along the way, KTM stopped acting like KTM. I know it sounds really cliche, but I think they sold their soul. To make it even more cliche, they made a Faustian bargain. Maybe KTM is better off just making 50,000 bikes a year for loyal fans who have a high tolerance for risk. You know who that sounds like? Sounds like Ducati. Maybe KTM should have just been like Ducati. But given that they've got Bajaj pulling the strings and CF Moto in their pocket, I don't think that's an option anymore. And I think KTM's just lost themselves. Thanks so much for watching all the way to the end of today's video. What do you think about KTM? Are you drinking that orange Kool-Aid, or will you not touch a Duke with a 100-foot pole? Let me know down below if your camshaft is experiencing premature wear. Thanks again for watching. I will see you on the next one.